because maybe there's people that. All right, well, because we were so late last time, maybe people are thinking that I couldn't get on, but no, we worked out all the technology issues. So I see Sarah is on. So Sarah, hopefully you get the recording going. I see, um, and we're good. All right, recording has started. Hello, everyone, and selling skills. This is our technically our fourth week in the course content, including the orientation. And so we're going to finish up a little bit of from chapter 3 in the book. I see a lot of people are joining now. Great. And then we'll move into some of the really what I think are really important. Most of the topics are important, but like the really high leverage skills as a salesperson or somebody that's engaged in selling or communicating. In chapter 4, we're going to talk a lot about communication skills and listening skills and ways to effectively communicate in all ways, email, phone, obviously face-to-face, right? Or Zoom like this, or Microsoft Teams in a video conference setting. But before we get into the actual topics, I want to talk a little bit about the assignment, which I just posted in Moodle. It's our first assignment. There'll be 2. This one is going to be 50 points. And I want you just to have an idea about, it's in there in week 4. And I'll put this also in areas where everybody can see it. So this will be due in 2.5 weeks. I put the date at the 26th of February to give you all ample opportunity to get it done. Okay, so basically what it is, the assignment is going to be around the buying process. Now, we talked a lot about this last class, the organizational behavior, the buying behavior process. And again, this is set up for an organization, but if you're an individual, just think about it for an individual or one-on-one or a small group. Okay. And what I want you to do is take these 8 steps that we go through anytime we are either buying something, if we're consuming something, or if we're selling something. And what I want you to do is a personal experience. Again, if you're not in sales, that's okay. But when you are engaged in a transaction, when you are buying or selling something, maybe you are buying a service like internet for your apartment, or maybe you are buying a product, clothing, a bicycle, a car, um, supplies, groceries. Maybe you went to a restaurant and had a meal. That's a product and a service. And so what I want you to do is take one experience you've had. Again, if you're in sales or some sales capacity, it would be great if you used that, but it's not, critical that you do that, especially those that are not fully engaged in the sales process. And I want you to look at these 8 steps and talk about at least one or more of these steps in relation to your experience. So, for example, if we were going to a restaurant and we were buying a meal, okay, and we were sitting down with some friends, what I want you to do is use these 8 steps to kind of talk about the process. Now, from that standpoint, you are a consumer, you are a buyer. So you're not selling, but you can at least look at this. What was the need? Well, I was hungry. What kind of restaurant was it? Did it have a large area to sit down, or was it mostly to go, takeout orders? talk about at least one, if not more, of the steps in your experience. Because I
Excuse me,
want you to
Professor.
think from this standpoint. Sometimes we don't go through every single one of the 8 steps when we're making a decision or when we're selling a
Excuse
service
me,
or
Professor.
product to somebody else. Um, and then what I want you to do is want you to write anywhere from 1 to 3 pages about your experience. Okay. So again, take your a personal experience. I see Ahmad has a question, so give me 1 second. Um, you'll use this framework and you'll talk about your experience using at least one of the steps. Now, you can use all 8, you can use 2. You could talk about maybe step just step 8, how you evaluated if it was a good product purchase for yourself, if it was a good meal, if it was a good restaurant, you had good service, or maybe it was awful, how you evaluated the performance of what you just went through and take it from that standpoint. Okay. And so what I want you to do, let's Ahmed, you had a question. So why don't you ask that now in relation to the assignment?
Yes, Professor. Actually, I just logged in like a minute ago. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly.
Yes. Actually, I just logged in like a minute or two ago, and
Okay.
I didn't fully understand the assignment. So, based on what I hear so far, we should talk about an experience, a personal experience, where we applied s- either all or some of these steps and talk about it. Am I clear so far?
Yes, you are. So it would be one of two viewpoints. So you are
Ah,
either the buyer of something, a service, a product, a consulting, somebody's helping coach you and maybe for finding a job. And or you are the seller. You are selling something, a service, a product, a coaching, a consulting. You're selling to either another person, a company. As we talked about the different buying channels, it could be a government, it could be a hospital, it could be a hotel chain, somebody that you're selling to. So one of those, you don't have to do both. Um, and so I meant exactly. So it's personal experience from one of those two perspectives, talking about at least one of these steps. Now, you might talk about all 8, you might talk about 3 that are important to you. And within that, I want you just to have and talk about how these steps relate to your experience. That's the most important point. And
thank you.
anywhere from 1 page, at least 1 page, no more than 3 pages. So words that's like 250 to 300 words to maybe 800 to 900 words. Okay. And so it's in week 4. There you can just use any kind of word processing software you have and just upload a file of those pages right into the Moodle. And you have 2.5 weeks, and I'll monitor to make sure everybody has enough time to get it done. Like I said, it's based on your own experience. So I'm not expecting it to be some, if you don't have sales experience, again, that's okay. But you bought something. And so what I want you to do is talk about how it was for you as the purchaser of that service, that product, that consulting, whatever it was that you purchased. And even then, you can talk about again one of these 8 steps, all of these 8 steps, or a few of them, how it related to how you made your decision, how you communicated, how you were satisfied, how you evaluated something. So, in that respect, I think you'll have a good sense of the process we follow. And again, if we're getting into sales and we're new to sales and you're not have a lot of experience selling something, it's helpful from the viewpoint of the buyer to know how you engage in the selling process, how you engage in the buying process. So again, this is all in Moodle. I posted it there in week 4. It says assignment number 1. I will also write up something so you have it again very clearly. Okay, I see Samya has a question. Yes, Samya, go right ahead.
Hi, Professor.
Hello.
Sorry, you said that you posted it on the Moodle in week 4, but I'm not seeing it there.
Interesting. I will double check and make sure it's under assignments there. It could be, now that I think about it, it's scheduled to show up today. It could
Okay.
be it's showing up a little bit later this afternoon.
Okay, got it. Thank
So
you. Thank you,
thank you.
Professor.
So it will populate sometime today. I might have the time again based on where you're at. It might show up, a little bit later on this afternoon, this evening, but definitely check it tomorrow. It will be there in full. I also gave some examples. So like if you were buying, again, if you were buying a product, if you were buying a service, or you were selling something, I tried to walk you through what you might notice in 1 or 2 of the steps. So it kind of gives you a framework, but these 8 steps are your framework. Again, I'm not looking for you to use all 8, but if you want to, that's fantastic. But I want you to start to think from the standpoint, I'm the buyer or I'm the seller, and these are the steps or the processes I go through when I'm making a buying decision, or I'm trying to sell something. These are the things I need to think about in order to be effective as a salesperson. Okay? So that's what I want you to know. Again, saying it here, it's posted or will show up in Moodle sometime later today. And I will again make reference to it. I'll probably put it in the WhatsApp group. Hey, take a look at the assignment. It's posted right now. There is a picture. I posted a file of this picture of the buying process. And I'll also post another way to look at this process kind of in a written out format, talking about these 8 steps. So you'll have a very clear idea of how to frame your discussion. Okay. Again, 1 to 3 pages. If you could double space, makes it easier to read. That would be great. So double space. And actually 1 to 3 pages double spaced is a lot less words for you to write anyway. So that's what I'm looking for. Okay. All right. So let's move along. I just wanted to talk one area
Professor, I
here.
have a question.
Is there another question?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
I'm
yes, go
sorry,
ahead.
I'm outside, so it's very noisy. I hope you can hear me. So in the 3 pages, I will choose any step from 1 to 8.
Yeah, well, what I want you to do again, it's up to 3 pages, so anywhere from 1 to 3 pages, to talk about, you don't have to talk about all 8 steps. You can just talk about 1 or 2 that are important in how you looked at the experience. But if you
Okay.
want to use all 8, that's fine. So obviously, if I asked you to look at your experience using all 8, it would take you more than 1 page. But here, what I want you to do is pick a few of the steps that are most important in your experience for you and talk about that. Now, you might talk about 5 of the steps in your experience. That's great. You might only talk about 2. But what I'm looking for is for you to make sure you go through your buying or selling experience using this framework. Ahmed, you had a
Shall
question. You're welcome.
shall
Yes,
citation
Professor.
included or references?
What's that?
Yeah, shall we include references or citation?
You can, sure. You can, and I made a note. You can certainly If there's a picture of the product or the service, you can include that. Any data that you want to include, absolutely. It's not required, but if it makes it easier for you to talk about your experience, absolutely. If you're talking about something you're selling and you have a product or service and you already have some notes based on what the buyer was wanting, you could make reference to that. So I want this to be a real experience that you've had from either the
Yeah.
buyer or the seller perspective. Okay?
Okay. Thank you very
You're,
much.
you're welcome. Ahmed, you had a question?
Yes, Professor.
Yes.
So basically, I'm not a seller. I don't sell either a service or a product, but I
Okay.
can talk about my experience as a buyer. Like,
Yes.
for example, I wanted to buy a mobile. What by
Yes.
remembering what steps I did, I can like link the academic points that's mentioned in the 8 points. I can now see them in my actions, right?
Yes.
So define I need a mobile, or I need a new mobile because my old one is damaged or became slow or whatever. Okay,
Yes.
so I will describe my process under the light of the 8 steps, right?
Yes. Exactly.
Okay,
That's
great.
that's exactly right.
Great.
So again, I'm sure there are other people that aren't engaged in selling right now, right? So, but you've bought something. You either bought a product, like Ahmed has bought a mobile phone, or you bought a service. Maybe you hired somebody to um, do some cleaning for you, okay? Or you hired somebody to do your paperwork. Like in the United States here, we have taxes. Tax season is coming up. If we're a business, we have to file our taxes. So I hire an accountant to help me do my taxes. So I could talk about how I decided to hire an accountant, how I chose them, the work that they do, my process for deciding if they did a good job. And I could talk about that in relation to the 8 steps. So absolutely. So I want you just again take an experience that you've gone through, again, either as a buyer or a seller, and relate it to at least one or more of the 8 steps. And I think as you start to do it, you'll start to realize that we make more decisions than we think we do. We look at more uh, options or different kinds of data points than we realize. We think about a lot of different things. Sometimes, again, if you're just, opening up your refrigerator and deciding what you want to eat, maybe we're not making a lot of decisions, but maybe we are, right? How did you, if you were the one that purchased that refrigerator, how did you decide to do that? If you were the one that, you can even talk about your decision to sign up for this MBA program at Windsor. How did you decide to do that? Right? What was important to you in that process? And how are you evaluating that, if you look at step 8, that you made a good purchase, right? So you can even talk about that. But again, we've all been through a lot of transactions where we were either the buyer or the seller. And I want you to just use one of those. And I think you'll start to realize that even though we think we're not in sales, we might not be in a sales job, that we're always in a transaction that is relational to selling. Okay. And that's why I think this course is so important, personal selling skills. Um, all right. So let's move along. There was one um, slide here I wanted to just point out at the very end of the um, here. So, one of the things last time we talked about, we're talking about the consumer buying process, right? And again, I know not everybody's a salesperson, but sometimes we are selling or we're buying something. So I want you to kind of think about when a salesperson is developing a sales strategy. This is kind of important. Again, we may not be a salesperson. We may be working in engineering for our company, but we may have to sell our ideas to our boss, to our manager, or to another employee. Or maybe we have to sell an idea. I say use the word sell, communicate an idea to somebody else. These are some important things to kind of think about as we make our decision about how to communicate. And again, this is from a selling standpoint. So think about this. If we are selling something, what is the customer considering, right? If you're communicating your idea to your manager, what might they be considering? Are they a supplier, right? Well, they supply the work. What are they considering? How are they going to evaluate what's happening? That word evaluation is so important. How will you evaluate if it's a good communication? If they heard you, if they decided to adopt what you decided to share with them, maybe they were very confused about what you were communicating. So think about how they're going to evaluate you, or how you're going to evaluate if it was a good purchase, right? All right. And then you kind of think about evaluation. We have this performance. We talk about this word performance. Again, this is part of some of these 8 steps, right? An evaluation. Did it do a good job? Did I do a good job communicating? I'm teaching this class today. Hopefully, I'm doing a good job communicating what the assignment was about and what the topics are for this course today, as we talk about communication and listening, right? So I have to be aware of my performance and how do I evaluate my own performance and how do I get better, right? And then I have to think about the weights. So here it is. If I'm talking to somebody, what is most important to them? They weight different things. In a selling transaction, I'm selling something. That buyer over there has 5 things maybe that are important to them, but maybe one is most important. It's up to us as the seller to figure out and ask questions for that buyer, what's most important. Because if we don't know what's most important, and we're talking about some of the other features of our product or service, it might be nice for us, but it's not helping them. So again, we need to find out, like Ahmed was talking about, he bought a new cell phone because his other one broke. Well, what was the most important feature or benefit? Now, he might have bought a phone. Maybe the phone wasn't as important as the cell phone service provider, because maybe he had products. He bought a phone before, it wasn't working, but maybe he went to different places and couldn't get a connection very strong. And so, so he's looking for reliability. Maybe that is his most important characteristic. So he weights that highly. So then he's evaluating all these different phones and these services. The one that speaks to reliability the most will probably be the one that he chooses, or one that he values highly. So you can kind of see how we go through these steps. Other implications, think about this. We're looking at other products or other services. And so we want to know how our product or service that we are selling or buying, maybe the buyer wants to know how it stacks up. Is it better than this product for certain areas? Is it worse? Right? Other things to think about as we go through this process. All of a sudden, I'm going to use your example about the cell phone. Reliability was very important to you. Maybe that was the number one issue. But then all of a sudden, you found 3 mobile carriers that all were reliable. Okay, so then you kind of use that. Okay, so what is the next most important point? Because now they all 3 are good. They're all reliable. Okay, so now I need to find what's the next most important point and weight that. Okay, so maybe it's the features of the phone in terms of maybe camera is really important. Maybe take a lot of pictures. So how is the quality of the camera? Okay. And then think about this, we talk about pricing, right? Prices are important for a service, for a product, for a consulting, so that could be for me to talk about price. Maybe I know already ahead of time my product is the most, we'll call it the premium product. It's the most expensive. But so I know the buyer might have an objection that my price is too high. So I know that ahead of time. So then how do I communicate that ahead of time in my mind to think, okay, they're going to have an objection. They're going to tell me my price is too high. How do I handle that? Right? If you're engaged in a conversation with a coworker and you're talking about, can you get them to do some of your work? Maybe you need help. Maybe they're part of a project. Okay. The price might not necessarily be money. The price might be time, right? If they feel that they have to spend a lot of time doing your work, they're not going to be happy and want to do it. But if you organize everything in a way so that the piece of the project that they're helping you work through is easy for them to do in terms of time, then maybe they'll say, you know what, I can help you. It's only going to take me 30 minutes. Okay, great. So you can kind of see implications for a salespeople or implications as we communicate. It's important. Thinking ahead is important. And that's what I'm trying to get you to kind of understand, this process. How do we communicate with people? A lot of times we don't think ahead to some of these areas that could be helpful for us to think about. All right. So that's it for that, finishing up chapter 3. I'm going to get into chapter 4 now, which is all about the communication process within the sales process. Okay. But again, it's communication for just about anything. All right. So as we go through elements of communication, listening. Why is that so important? Questioning. Are we a good questioner? Do we have thoughtful questions? If we're a good communicator, if we're good at making influence with people, we're good at asking questions and good at listening. And then I want you to kind of think about there, if you're a salesperson, how can we develop these skills, right? How can we develop listening skills and use them to gain information about our customer, about another person, about a company, right? How do we communicate without words? We're going to talk a lot about body language, like, facial expressions and how we move our eyes, various things that we might not pay a lot of attention to, but that are available for us to notice. If you remember in week 1, we talked a lot about emotional intelligence. Part of emotional intelligence is reading the emotions, the mood of another person. How do we know that? And just because they're frowning, maybe it's not that they don't like what we're talking about. Maybe they sprained their ankle and they're in a little bit of pain. And that frown is because they're in pain. And it has nothing to do with our product or service. So if we're good at asking questions, we can find that out. If we're good at listening, we can pick up some of these key points. And then we'll talk a little bit about, communicating, email, texting, phone, social media, all those things. And a little bit about, you know, how do we adjust for differences in cultures, right? Some people, even differences in the kinds of ways people communicate. I think that's important. Okay, so let's move along here, and you can kind of see in terms of this process of communicating, it's two ways. It has to be two ways, right? That's what communication is about. I have something I'm communicating to somebody else, or they're communicating to me. And how do I understand it? So what I'm trying to do is encode. I'm trying to take what I'm thinking and my ideas and put them into words. Okay. How well I do that is a learned skill, right? How well I do that and communicate those words to the buyer or to the other person I'm talking to, that is we can call it an art, a skill we can develop. Okay. The second piece, decoding, right? These fancy words, but we kind of know what this already means, right? So we have to understand the information we're getting back, right? How do we interpret what kind of information we're receiving? We're decoding, right? We're talking to the other person. We're asking them questions. We're listening. Okay, we're taking our ideas about the product or service we have, or about how we're communicating. We're taking our thoughts, saying those into words. Sometimes we write them down. We'll talk about that, right? In like emails or text messages. How do we interpret our messages getting through to the other person? Because that's what feedback is, right? We give information to somebody else, and we need to know how we're doing. We call that feedback, how we're performing. Did we buy what we wanted to buy? We set out, we went to a store to buy a particular, you know, maybe we needed a new pair of pants. We went to the store. Instead of pants, we bought socks. Or the salesperson sold us shoes. Did we do a good job communicating? Maybe they didn't listen. We said we needed pants. Now, if we bought a pair of pants and they said, well, I have a pair of shoes that could go nicely with these pants. If you go to a clothing store, they're doing a job of selling you, right? They're trying to find out, oh, you bought these new pants. Oh, you might need new socks that go with them. Oh, you might need new shoes. So it's this idea of encoding. They're communicating, putting their ideas to words. Are they doing a good job of communicating that? And then we'll know if the feedback is good or not, right? So it's kind of clear. We can kind of see it in this. Again, this is right out of the book. You kind of see. All right. So it is this cycle of how things work. All right. So let's start with the seller. The seller encodes a message back. We'll take it from that perspective. I'm selling something, and the sender, you can say the sender, the seller, however you want, they have a message, and they need to communicate that to a buyer, right, on the top. So they talk to the buyer and say, I have this great product. Would you like to buy it? Okay. And, you know, the job they do, then the buyer will then decode the message and communicate a reply to the sender, right? The sender, in this case, is now the buyer because they heard you talk about your product. And maybe they're going to say, you know what? I don't need your product. They're communicating something. And then the seller has to interpret that, decode that, and then talk. Now, obviously, we have a conversation with somebody. We communicate with people. We go through this process. Again, we don't really think about it in this way, but sometimes it's helpful to break it down, because think about this. If you're not communicating, or if there's a broken part of the communication, like the buyer is not hearing what you have to say. I mean, think about this in a conversation with somebody, a friend, a coworker, somebody at a store. Okay, you're trying to communicate something and they don't understand. You're trying to help them, right? In the beginning of this class, we talked about the assignment, right? About the 8 steps of the buying process. Think about how we went through this flow of information. People had questions. I communicated the assignment. People had questions. So do I need to use all 8 steps or do I need to use one? And so I answered that question. And then we had other questions. Now I don't sell. I'm not in sales, but I could talk about something from a buying standpoint, like my mobile. Great. Let's do that. So you see how this is a full cycle. And if we get better at asking questions, if we get better at listening, if we get better at interpreting the data that we're getting back, the information, we'll be better at communicating. We'll be better at selling. We'll be better at, here's a good point too to make, we'll be better at when somebody is selling us, able to interpret different ideas better. So we can be better at buying, more informed. Okay, so that's the way things go. I talked a little bit about like breakdowns. Think about this. This is important too to consider. Problems in communicating. Okay, the environment. If it's very loud, okay, I've been to some places where, if you remember, one of the things I sold were hardwood flooring finishes, things that protect hardwood floors and furniture, the coatings. And some of the places I went to were very loud. They were manufacturing plants or hardware stores. And it was very loud. They had the machines going on. And so that made it difficult for me to communicate effectively. So I had to find out, okay, do I talk louder or can we go to a different place and communicate? Can we go to an office and close the door? Can't always do that, right? If you think about it, you're having a conversation with somebody on your mobile and you're outside and it's loud and they can't hear you very carefully. Do we get frustrated sometimes? Or the connection isn't great. They hear every other word. So you got to think about some of what causes a communication breakdown. Not only that, but then how do you handle that? Do you get frustrated or could you be creative and figure out a way to do that? We're not always perfect. So think about it. We're not always perfect. Buyers don't always follow the model of communication. Of course not. Maybe all they're doing is asking irrelevant questions that have nothing to do with your product because they're mad about something. Who knows, right? Our job is to uncover their true motive, right? By asking good questions. Maybe they're all using price as a barrier, okay? And your product is high price, and maybe they keep saying, you know, it's way too much money. I don't care, it's just way too much money. But if you're good at communicating, you can figure out, well, maybe there is something they really need, reliability. And maybe your product offers that better than anybody else. So you can communicate the fact that, you know, you buy my product, you only have to buy it once in the next 5 years because it will last. Yes, you can buy cheaper products that might last 1 year, but in 3 years, you're spending twice as much money if you purchasing my product. So it becomes this engagement back and forth. All right. So now what I want to get into and just talk for a little bit about choices of words. Okay. So the way we verbally communicate messages effectively, and how do we do that? Okay. Think about, we'll talk about messages, verbal, written as an email or a text, a proposal. We write up a whole big thing and we send it to somebody. So that's written. Maybe it's got diagrams. Maybe it's got comparisons to how your product is with others. Again, if you're in a work setting and you're trying to do a proposal to another department to get them to help you, think about how you communicate. So choices of words are important, right? Do we use long, wordy conversation or phrases? Do we use well, some people like to use, I've been in sales long enough. Some people have very, we'll call, strange senses of humor. Okay. And they might tell your humor that's kind of offensive. And okay, I've been in some situation. It depends on the climate and the culture sometimes. Do we want to use slang and foul language? Probably not. Although there are some buyers that's how they communicate. They swear every other word. That's how they communicate. And so maybe for you to know ahead of time that that's the way they communicate, maybe that they feel comfortable. Now, we should probably avoid that again, but there's always gray area. We talked about it in week 1. There's always gray area. So we want to be able to demonstrate that we know our product or service, that we know what we're talking about, right? And providing grace and charm, I just call it kindness. Can we be kind with our communication? And it's not going to be perfect, okay? Things to avoid, things to do, so let's move along here. It's pretty standard. Again, think about when we're talking to somebody that maybe we don't know very well, but we're trying to communicate a point. Even if you're not in sales, you kind of think about this. Again, the words that we use to represent a product or service, what are we pulling from? Complicated words, or words that they might understand. Now, if we speak a different language, right, I'm communicating English, and the person you're talking to, English is a second language. They don't understand English very well, but they understand Spanish well. Maybe they know more Spanish than they know English. And so sometimes, and I know this for a fact, I have a friend in Florida that he's selling, and I think I mentioned him, selling these machines that cut granite. And he's in South Florida. And so the population down there, there's a lot of Cuban Americans, there's a lot of Spanish speaking people. So he has an employee that works for his company that is fluent in Spanish. So he helps to make the conversation understandable. You can bring in somebody else to help you. Think about that. All right. So there's a lot to think about. How do we communicate? I want you to think from your standpoint when the communication wasn't going so well. You were in sales, you were a buyer, you were a seller, you were talking to somebody in your family. Think from a minute when it didn't go well. Have that in your head as we talk about these kinds of things. Voice characteristics. How fast are we talking? If somebody's talking so fast you can't hear, you can't make a decision because you only hear every other word because they're talking so fast you can't understand them, that's a problem. If they're talking too slow, maybe you're getting distracted because they're talking too slow. Somebody's talking very loud. Or think about this. We've had this in our conversations already. We're online. And in the beginning, I couldn't hear somebody speaking till they turned their volume up, right? Because they said, can you hear me? Right? So loudness is important. Maybe it's too loud. Maybe the tone of my voice. Maybe I'm talking kindly, or maybe I'm talking and the back, I'm thinking I'm angry or I'm frustrated. You can tell when somebody's frustrated how they're communicating sometimes. Okay. And then can you articulate? Can you pronounce the sounds well so people can hear you? Maybe you have the right words, but you can't pronounce them correctly in a way that they understand. So if you think about how do we communicate a message if we have some of these problems, these blocks, we need to use other things. Maybe we need to show them what we're talking about. I was talking to my wife about exercising and using different things yesterday. And we had a breakdown of communication. I was talking about one thing, she was hearing another. I said, let me show you what I mean. So I literally showed her what I was talking about. Ah, I got it now. So sometimes that's what we need to do. But it's always this trying to develop, here's the thing, and this highlighted in red, this word picture, right? We are trying to create, we're telling stories, we're talking about how this helped us or how this didn't help us or what we need. We're trying to create a word picture for the other person to understand. And if we can do that, one of the ways we do it so well is use analogies. We use analogies to communicate ideas that are very complicated. Give you an example. So a lot of the work I do, I do coaching work, and I work with, as we said at the very beginning, student athletes. And I'm communicating ideas about how do we use our mind better to help our performance. That's a very abstract kind of thing, okay? How do I use my mind better? What is even the mind, right? So I use this analogy. And I tell people, okay, when you're performing well, think about this for you. When you're performing well, it's like a recipe, okay? You're baking something, you're making something. You have a recipe, you're following steps, right? There's ingredients. What are the ingredients in your recipe for, say, you're making a banana bread? What are the ingredients? You're making cookies. What are the ingredients? What are you using? What's important? And if you do a good job performing well, your recipe tastes great. What happens if instead of, by accident, instead of putting sugar in your cookies, you put salt? You put a cup of salt instead of a cup of sugar. Think about that. You're eating something, you go to the bakery, they made a mistake. That would be awful. That's like comparing, okay, I didn't perform very well. So that is an analogy. If I'm selling a product, I need to think about ways to communicate that create a good story, a good word picture for my buyer. When we communicate, we're always have this ability to use examples, right? An example of somebody that bought this product before, how it helped them. That's another way to communicate effectively. An analogy, again, a metaphor, something that can help them understand beyond just the words. All right? So we're having this dialogue, we're communicating. And this thing, this word active listening, right? What is active listening? You're all listening to me teach this class right now. Now, are you listening or are you actively listening? Now, what could be hearing, I think there's a difference between I'm hearing, yes, professor, I hear you. But listening is listening with the intent to understand. This is a good rule of thumb, 80-20. I have another way I look at this too. The 80-20 rule is you should listen 80% of the time and talk 20% of the time. Because if you're good at asking questions, you don't need to be talking a lot. You can listen and get all the information you need by asking a couple questions and a couple follow-up questions. Talking to a friend. Maybe all they need you to do, they've gone through a hard time. Maybe all they need you to do is just listen to what they're saying. You don't need to say, you could talk 5% of the time. And what's going to happen is the communication is going to be really strong because they're going to feel heard. Okay? And so I heard this years ago being in sales. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth. You may have heard that. Again, I'm using a metaphor, an analogy. If we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, we should listen. This is my rule of thumb, at least twice as much as we talk. And so we can kind of think about that. Here they're talking about the 80-20 rule. If we're listening twice as much as we talk, that's more like 2/3, 1/3. But what that's saying is we need to be listening more than we're talking. And that's important when we're engaged in a communication with somebody. And you may know people, all they do is talk, right? You're having a conversation, or you may be having a dialogue with a coworker. They like to talk. They're doing 80% talking, but you're doing 80% listening. Who do you think is going to get more of the information in a way that's understandable? You might, because you're listening more. Now, here's a fun thing. They're doing 80% talking, and you're trying to do 80% talking. What's going to happen? Not a very good conversation. Not a very good selling transaction, right? The words per minute, I'm not going to really worry about that. It's like what's comfortable. You know, you can go through these processes here. But there's different levels of listening here, right? When we're talking, and think about this. Like, again, I said we're hearing. We're tuning in, tuning out. Maybe while, hopefully not, but while I'm teaching this class, you have your phone by you, you're checking your messages. And as families do, there could be somebody in the other room that needs your attention. So we're not fully engaged. We're human. That happens sometimes, right? So that's level 1. Level 2 is passive listening, where it's like, there's not a lot of distractions, but I'm just not interested in what you're saying very much. So I'm just kind of like going to sit back and not make a great effort to convey what I'm hearing. Okay? A lot of people do that. Active listening is all about, and you know this, right? If we are engaged with somebody, we even go to a store and we have a conversation with somebody, or we go to a market and we see a friend that we haven't seen in a while. We have a conversation, and it's like you could feel the energy. It's exciting. That's active listening. So it's almost like how we feel. Are we engaged? Are we talking about our feelings? Do we know what's going on? Do we observe body language, which we'll talk about in a moment? And if we're active listening, we're going to make sure that when we're talking to somebody, the phone is off or in another room, right? That's active listening. If we're going to be successful at any communication, we're going to be a good active listener. Okay? How do we do that? How are we good at being a good listener? So here's some suggestions, all right? We're talking to somebody. We don't hear them clearly. Maybe they're talking too fast. So, or maybe we're talking a little too fast and they don't hear us very clearly. Repeat the information. And then ask them the question. Does that make sense? Do you understand? Repeat back to me what you just heard, right? Restating, rephrasing. That's a good way to check if we're listening. Clarifying information is like, okay, you're talking about a proposal you just made, and the potential buyer, right, has questions. They don't understand your service, right? You said that you service your product over 90 days, right? That's the guarantee. You'll be there, your product. Maybe they're like, I don't understand. What do you mean 90 days? I want your product and it's going to last for 2 years. You're telling me in 6 months I'm not going to be able to reach you? Clarifying information. So if you summarize also the conversation, when we're done, if you notice at the end of this conversation, this class, I'll try to summarize what we're going to do. I'll summarize the assignment. I'll summarize this chapter 4. Right? And when we get into chapter 5, I'll summarize that too a little bit, right? That helps us kind of pull the information and leave us in a good place. This idea about silence, right? Do we tolerate it? Some people talk a lot. Some people take time to process information. Do we allow the person we're talking to enough time, enough space where there's quiet. People don't like pausing and quiet. Here's the key in sales. If you're a salesperson and you ask the question and you don't want to talk over the buyer, especially if you're asking for the order, let them tell you. Sometimes silence is uncomfortable. That's okay. Make it comfortable. Be comfortable with the uncomfortable. If you're in sales, if you're in communicating with somebody, it's important to be comfortable with the uncomfortable. Being comfortable means that you can tolerate it. Okay? So let's move along here. Nonverbals. So we'll go through these pieces and then we'll take a 10-minute break. So in about 10 minutes, we'll take a 10-minute break. Reading nonverbals. This is important too. We talked about active listening. So how do you do that better? Part of listening is getting information that's not spoken. Part of that, they call it nonverbals, because there's nothing being communicated out of somebody's mouth. But what we're doing is we're observing, we're seeing. Okay, body angle. Somebody's talking to you and they're kind of staring out to the side. If I was teaching this class, I'm going to turn my computer and I was like this to you and you see me on the screen. Are you going to be paying attention if you kind of only see half my face? Think about that. Now, if I'm engaged, obviously there's limitations in where the camera is. So sometimes you can't see my eyes looking right at you because my camera is up on the top of the computer. If it was in the middle, I'd always be looking right at you. Okay, but facial expressions, you have your cameras off, right? But maybe you're all frowning like, why are we talking about this? This class is terrible, right? This is the worst class I've ever taken. Goodness, this professor, he's so boring. Hopefully I'm not. And you think about this, facial expressions tell a lot because, again, like I said at the beginning, you might have to ask a clarifying question. The person you're talking to is frowning, may not have anything to do with you. They might be in pain. Maybe they're thinking about something they have to do later on. Again, the emotional intelligence is important to understand what's going on inside them emotionally. The nonverbals tell you something, okay? Arm movements. Some people talk a lot with their hands. Some people point. Some people use hand gestures, different things, open hands, closed hands. They can tell you things. How we place our legs. If you're having a conversation with somebody and somebody puts their legs up on the table, maybe that's indicate that they're really relaxed, or maybe that's an indication of they think they're passive listening, right? You're sitting up. Think about this. Even do this right now, okay? Do this right now. This is how powerful nonverbals are. We'll talk about this from emotional intelligence standpoint. While you're listening to me, and engaging in this conversation about this class and this topic of nonverbals, I want you to kind of just lean forward a little bit, but like kind of not even have, like a care in the world. Like you're not attentive, like you're just kind of loose. You're even leaning to the side a little bit. Do that. Notice how that feels. Now, if you're doing that while you're talking to somebody, think about that. Are you going to be as effective in communicating that way? Now, sit up straight. Sit up with your back upright. Not too tense, not too tight, but alert. That's going to be a signal to your brain to communicate more effectively. In fact, while you're talking, you're going to get more air through your lungs to be able to communicate. You're like this. It's hard to talk. It's hard to get air through. You may have to be yelling. You may be hoarse. So the nonverbals help us communicate too. It's not just reading other people's nonverbals. We need to know about our nonverbals as well. That's the body language patterns that we're talking about. All right. So we're going to go through a few of these, just to kind of see, body angle. Think about this. Are people moving side to side when they're talking to you? What does this mean, right? If somebody's back and forth, they're leaning forward. That's usually positive. If they're leaning back, maybe they're just processing. Maybe they need more space. Leaning back, maybe they're angry. They don't want to be with you, right? Think of somebody you're talking to. If you're leaning forward, maybe that is more of a positive signal. It's not a perfect science. It's not 100%. But somebody's body angle in relation to you says something. And so you can interpret that, right? If somebody's talking to you and they're very excited, you can hear that in their voice. You can see in their facial expressions. They may be leaning towards you. They're excited. They're moving their hands like that. If they're bored, maybe they're not doing a whole lot. Maybe they're looking away. So kind of start to think about this. Intuitively, we know. Sometimes we know somebody, we're not communicating well. And there's something going on here. So this is a kind of a nice summary of facial expressions. If you're really into facial expressions, I'm going to put this in the chat. There's somebody that studied facial expressions very much. He's a psychologist, Paul Ekman. If you want to be the best in the world at studying facial expressions, Paul Ekman, psychologist, is amazing because he did all these studies about how we interpret faces. There's another person, and these people aren't in the book. They don't list them, which is unfortunate. That's why I want to list them here. John Gottman. He actually and his wife studied how people communicate using facial expressions, and they call them micro expressions, things that you can pick up on that are so quick, but you can interpret that are so accurate into how somebody is feeling and communicating and processing the information. All right, so that Paul Ekman and John Gottman, if you're interested in getting better at facial expressions or communicating, think about this. If you are staring at somebody, that might indicate that you're more angry. If the person you're talking to is staring you down, like, right? Maybe that's like they don't like you. And you can use that to open up the conversation, right? If you see in their face that they're very tight in their neck and their cheeks, they're holding a lot of tension. Maybe something's uncomfortable. Asking a question to notice that is important because maybe they're giving you a signal. Again, it could have nothing to do with your product or service or you, but it's important in the context of what you're communicating to understand why they're tight. Maybe they exercised in the morning and they pulled a muscle and they're feeling that. This happens sometimes. You go to bed, you get up in the morning and it's like, ooh, I must have slept wrong because there's a tension in my neck. Ever that happened to you? You wake up in the morning and it's like, oh, it's tight. I can't move my neck as much. You might have that tension. You're talking to somebody. It's important to know if that's about you and your product or service or has nothing to do with your product or service. That's important to kind of interpret that. All right? Interpreting arms and legs. Other kinds of motions we make. Again, if we're on a video call, maybe we can't see everything going on. Maybe we can't see their feet, right? But if you're talking to somebody, there's a lot to pay attention to. To pay attention to. How we move, like closed fists. Sometimes that's like, open hands. That's like a sign we're more relaxed. If your buyer is more relaxed, they'll give you some of these more relaxed signals. That's important. If you notice them being tight and tense and they're pulling back, maybe that's a sign to you that maybe I'm not doing a good enough job communicating the value of my product. So I need to do a better job. That's how we interpret. Again, if you want to get better at this, Paul Ekman, John Gottman are amazing for body language improvement. Okay. Again, these are in your book, so I'm not going to spend too much time with them. They're kind of helpful to kind of see if somebody's shaking their head like this, that is usually a signal that they're understanding you. If they're shaking their head like this, maybe it means like, oh, I don't get them. And a lot of times, here's the thing, here's the key. The buyer might not even realize that they're nodding. Think about that. It's kind of under the hood, if you will. That's why it's nonverbal. They're not communicating with their words, but they're communicating with their body. Okay. Eye contact. In some parts of the world, eye contact is not made. In the Asian culture, if you're in sales, sometimes it's not good to look somebody right in the eye. So it's okay to look to the side. But if you don't look somebody in the eye when you're selling something, in a lot of cultures, that might mean you have something to hide. What are they not telling me? Right? Be aware of that. Okay. So it's, again, a lot of gray area here, but there's some things to think about. Communication is a lot more than just the words we use. A little bit more on body language, then we'll take a break before we get into like communicating with email and messages of that nature. Patterns. Okay, think about this. We're talking and we're saying how happy we are with your service. And yet we're leaning back and frowning. Is there a contradiction? Are they trying to hide their true feelings? Now, I don't know how many people here are in relationships, but if you're in a relationship, whether you're married or, you know, you have a partner or even with your kids, the partners, a lot of times, if they know us well enough, they know when we're trying to hide something. Yes, we're saying the right words, but something, their signal they're getting is like, what's going on? The communication that they're picking up is maybe my facial expressions, maybe some way I'm moving my body, maybe something I'm not saying is tipping them off. So there's a communication, we'll call it a contradiction, between what I'm saying and what they're hearing. And then, again, if we're the listener, can we pick up on that? And it's not enough just to pick up on that. We got to interpret that. Remember, we're encoding and decoding this information at the very beginning. We talked about that. So for decoding, what does that mean? What does that mean? And how then could we communicate better? We may just have to ask questions because we don't know the true meaning of that conversation. And think about this. To uncover those communications that people don't want to communicate, we have to encourage the person we're talking to be honest. That means we need to be honest, right? If we encourage them to share, they also need to feel safe that they can share the information with us, right? This buzzword that's talked about in psychology, they call it psychological safety. You may not have a lot of that in the company you work for. Can you share a grievance, something that you dislike, with the management in your company? If there is a lot of psychological safety, they encourage you to be honest. They're not going to retaliate for you sharing your displeasure. But if there's not a lot of safety, people are not going to share. If there's not a lot of safety in the conversation, in the buying process, your customer's not going to tell you the truth all the time. They might hide something. They might tell you half the truth. Okay, so you need to have that open exchange, which is really important. All right, again, think about these things when we're communicating non-verbally. Smiling. Do we smile when we talk? Eye contact. What are the gestures we're making? Non-verbals are like, you know, in times of COVID, are we shaking people's hands? I think we are again. Or are you giving them a fist bump? Or are you just waving? You know, it's different for every situation. And conversation, what is the way that you help them, guide them in their level of comfort? I think as a salesperson, you kind of need to think about, or when we're communicating, how can I make the other person feel comfortable in this setting? It's kind of like this being kind in the conversation. A lot of it is the language, but a lot of it is the nature. And think about this. We're gonna take a break. I want to leave you with this thought as you take your break. Those people who you know that communicate very well, that make you feel comfortable, that you're always able to share things with, what are they doing? How do they make you feel comfortable? Do they share in a particular way? Is it their voice? Are their nonverbals? And then think about this, those that you have a difficult time communicating with, what's going on with them? And maybe why can't they communicate very well? So when we come back, as you think about that and take your 10 minutes, I want you to think about that. And we'll have a little discussion about people that you're communicating with that are really good, and people that you're communicating with. Again, think about this. If you're in sales or you're in a business situation that it's not going well, we can kind of debrief on that and talk a little bit about that and get the dialogue going. Okay. All right. So take your 10 minutes and I will see you back in shortly. Okay.
Yes, Professor.
All right. Hello, everybody. You're probably still just getting back. Those are that are back and are available. We'll get started. Again, I wanted just to talk a little bit about, think about this in terms of the communication that we have in our jobs, or, with somebody that we have, that we know, where the communication is good, where things are being said and spoken in a way that people understand, where you're able to ask questions, where you feel safe to talk. Okay. And maybe you can then think also of a situation that was a difficult conversation where the communication wasn't good. Things weren't being said in a way that people understood what was happening. Maybe you purchased something and the product didn't do what it said it was going to do, and you went back to the store to return it, and maybe they gave you a hard time. Talk about that communication of what was happening there. Or you were communicating with somebody and there were distractions. It was very loud. Again, just from a practical standpoint, I want you to put yourself, think back in the last month, week, couple of days, this last weekend, a dialogue you had, a communication you had, either with your work or personally with friends, with somebody you talk with. I want to hear from you. Just talk about what you noticed in that conversation. Say, yeah, I was talking with a coworker and we were having a hard time. That was the example you can use. Or I was talking with my friend and it was really a good conversation, and we were talking and it felt good, and we were understanding each other. I was listening. I want you to talk about some of the principles we talked about. Good communication. Talk about the nonverbals, what you noticed. Talk about, what wasn't good in the communication, either that you weren't good at communicating or you didn't understand the other. So let me open it up. Ask anybody to share who would like to share. Please take yourself off mute and share your video. And just, again, talk about some interaction you had with another, either in a buying situation, a selling situation, or just a communication where it was good communication or where it wasn't. So who would like to share?
Can I?
Absolutely. Hello.
Hello. Yes, I had an experience last week. I wanted to buy a TV. So it was the first seller who came to me, and it was looking like he knows better what I want, really. He started to suggest me. I tried to explain him what exactly I'm looking for and what kind of characteristic it's important for me. But he said to me that no, you should buy this TV because it's new, something, something. And moreover, he was always looking in his phone and chatting with somebody, I don't know, and I was waiting maybe 10 minutes or 15, and after I asked to change this salesperson for another. After the young girl came to me, and she was very attentive. She was listening what I wanted. She gave 2 or 3 options and explain why this one is better than this one, what kind of choice I can do, and also she's describing advantages and disadvantages that I can take my sole decision. So she was listening what I want. She was providing all expertise I asked to do, and she was very attentive and involved in the selling process.
Yeah. Did you wind up buying a TV from her, or are you
Yes,
still
of course.
okay?
Yes, yes. She
So
was very nice. She's after also explaining about warranty, how I can proceed with some kind of details, and if I want to change it during the 1 month, what should I do, where should I call, and so on. So she provides all the details I might need further even.
yeah, so think about it. Thank you so much, because you just explained both sides, right? You had a salesperson. That's terrific. You had a salesperson that was, as we talked about, not giving you good eye contact, looking at his phone, telling you what they wanted that they thought was important, not asking you what you wanted important, right? And then you're like, I'm frustrated. I need somebody else. A lot of customers might have been like, I'm going to walk out of the store. I'm going to go somewhere else. But you were patient enough to say, okay, I came here. I have a purchase, that I have a reason why. Send me somebody good. And
It
you
was
had the
very
perfect.
bad weather. It was
Yeah,
very
well,
bad
there you
weather
go.
to go
Yeah,
anywhere else.
yeah. But at least then somebody then came who was like you said, good in communicating, good in listening, good in making, and think about this. We talked about word pictures and alternatives. They gave you, here's the benefit, here's the feature, and gave you some options. And then you were able to decide. They created more rapport with you because they were engaged. And so, and you bought from that salesperson. So you can kind of see how important it is to communicate well and what happens when we don't, right? We engage in these kinds of conversations all the time, but sometimes we don't stop to think about what can we learn from them to make us better at communicating, right? We know, and I said this last time too, we know when there's a salesperson, they're just trying to sell us, and they don't really care about what we need or what we want, right? And that makes us feel uncomfortable. And so if you're in sales or if you're communicating something, think about that. If we don't have the information we need, sometimes we have to ask the questions. So then we know what's important to them. And that's great. Thank you. Fantastic example. So, all right, let's take time for at least one more share. Elena, you have your hand up. Perfect.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Professor Todd. I can share this experience of last week. As I've told before, that I work for a consultancy company now, and we implement the softwares and implement the business process of selling. So I was a project manager of one project where we had sold the consultancy of implementation of one type of software, which is called Croatia. Unfortunately, there was a misunderstanding between the client and the software engineers when there was communication between them. However, when our project had started, we faced the issue that the client was very upset with the conditions which were provided by the supplier directly, though the communication was between all of them before our project started. So we faced this situation, and what we did, we communicated, understood the issue. I contacted directly that supplier, and we settled down the situation and arranged and agreed for the best conditions for the customer, because there was misunderstanding between the customer directly and the supplier, and we as a agency, we due to our communication skills, we changed this and finally implemented the software the way client wanted and what he expected.
Yeah, and that is the whole. That's the whole cycle, and how we communicate and how things get done. And it just because we have a poor communication or there's a problem, that's an opportunity also, if you think about it, because now your customer is happier. Now you implement it in the way they expected you're gonna, but you also solved the problem and you were reliable to get that handled for them. So now you build trust. And then they know that if there's another issue where maybe there's a communication problem between, an engineer or somebody behind the scenes, and they're not getting what they need, you'll be there to get it worked out. And so they're not going to be as, they're going to be more trusting of you, and maybe then they'll stay with you longer based on that. So very good. That's exactly, if you kind of think about it, just because we have a poor communication doesn't mean that it's like, oh my God, the earth is coming to an end. If we work on our skill, then we can have a really good transaction, and everybody wins in the end. So great. Thank you, Elena. Very good.
Thank you.
Mohammed, you wanted to share. So you're the next, you're right up.
Oh, actually, I would like to ask before sharing, because
okay. Yes.
yeah, because selling, as we learned now, is selling product or selling service. What about or consultation? What about selling? I mean, let's say selling ideas, or convincing other people to sell your idea to them, because they are you are in a conflict right now, and you want to sell your idea into their mind, to change their mind about their perception, and to take them towards your direction. Is it type of sale, or this is type of communication, or what? How can we name this kind of action?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I would say, sometimes maybe from the standpoint of it's definitely communication, and selling is communicating. Okay. And so, like I said, if we're communicating ideas, some people don't like the word selling in that kind of situation. If we're trying to get them to, maybe we're trying to get them to buy into our ideas. We're trying to influence them to understand, and we're trying to persuade them, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So yes, this class is called Selling Skills, but like I said at the beginning, I think it's communication. I would say from that perspective, it's about communicating and having them, the word I would also say is influence, trying to be influential getting them to take your side or your point of view. There is a lot of this communication process in doing that, because again, you have to think about what are the barriers, what are the points where you're not reaching them. And you need to think about, you can even think about from that standpoint of that buying process, those 8 steps. How are they evaluating what you're saying to them? Do they understand what you're saying to them? Do they think you're trying to sell them? Do they think that you don't hear them? And so there needs to be a way that there is this trust developed where they can feel like you understand where they're coming from. And once that is there, once that relationship is there in terms of that energy flow, you can kind of call it, then you have a better chance to communicate and get them and influence them to your point of view so you can persuade them. But it becomes this, I guess it's like how we think about this, right? The emotional intelligence, how we're encoding our information. So I would say, even if you're a salesperson, maybe you don't think of each situation as a selling transaction. You think you're helping somebody. You think you're communicating in a way to help you. And so if you're doing that, maybe from that standpoint, it becomes this helpful way. So yeah, I mean, I guess you don't have to always think about it's selling, right? But always we're communicating. And sometimes if we're the buyer, sometimes we don't want to be sold to, we want to be communicated to. And so from the very first example about the TV, you see it's a communication. Yes, they're selling a TV and options, but it's a back and forth. Here are the options, here are the benefits. You make the choice. And that created a good environment for the connection to happen. And then, yes, we made a purchase, bought the TV. Yes, hopefully they bought into our ideas. So you don't always, like I said, this course is selling skills. But I think that, again, the most important piece, and that they have a whole chapter, they have multiple chapters we'll talk about, on communication, because that's really what selling is. The first chapter was about selling, right? Every other chapter in this book is about a part of how you communicate. Either it's getting information, it's giving information, or it's organizing the information in a way to communicate it. And so these are life skills, I think. So when we think about that, if we're engaging in any conversation, it becomes this ability of us to, do we have good listening skills? Can we ask good questions? Can we communicate? If we can do that well, then we can be a great salesperson. We really could. We could be successful. Maybe not great. Maybe that's not the word, but we can be successful in our role, even if we're not in sales. So good. Does that help? Does that help, Mohammed?
Yes, sure. Yes. Thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome. Okay, so let's move along. I just want to be mindful of the time here and let you all out on within an hour or so. So let me I'm going to share again the rest of those slides. We'll go back and finish out this chapter as we talk a little bit about some of the non-verbal kinds of communication that we have. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about emails and good things. One, this is interesting too, and just think about this. For instance, dress, right? this is kind of a nonverbal thing. How we dress communicates something to another person. So obviously I have a shirt here with a collar. If I came and did this class and I had I'll call a cutoff t-shirt with, you know, maybe music lyrics on it or punk rock or something would that be a successful way? What does that communicate to you taking this class? So when we're thinking about communication, think about the dress, the way where our appearance is, and how that communicates to the other person. In sales, it's important, right? There's some selling environments. If you're selling in manufacturing, they're not going to wear a suit. They're going to probably have a hard hat and goggles on when you're talking to them. But certain places, a suit and tie for a man or a business suit for a woman, nice outfit, right? Other settings, you know, if you're selling in a gym, a fitness center, you're not going to wear a tie or, you know, a lot of jewelry, right? You're probably going to have athletic gear on, and you might have shorts, and you might have a t-shirt if you're in that environment. So you need to match what your dress is for based on what you're communicating. If you go to a job interview face to face, you want a nice set of clothes, right? You want something pleasing that, you know, that you've organized in a nice way. You don't wear a cutoff t-shirt or shorts. Depending on what you're interviewing for, most places you don't. So that's just another consideration. Think about the tone your clothes and how you dress sets. Okay? Technology. I mean, we're engaged in technology communication right now, right? Video conferencing. Communication is still words, it's still images, but it's through technology. Now, if I use the Moodle site and I communicate a message to you, or I use Microsoft Teams and I use the calendar, it's another way to communicate, right? And so while we're talking about communication, a heads up, right? So this is our second Tuesday class in a row. We're going to go back to Saturdays for the next 2 weeks. So you're going to see me twice this week. So on Saturday, and it's in Microsoft Teams in your calendar. I will put a note in the WhatsApp group as well. We're meeting on Saturday of this week, and then the following Saturday. Then we'll go back to Tuesday. But you see, I'm communicating that with you via technology and with words, different methods, okay? We use many different methods to communicate. Think about, I put it in Moodle. I put it in Microsoft Teams, and I communicate through the WhatsApp group, and I'm telling you about it here. And you could probably use WhatsApp with a general message to the other people enrolled in this class. Hey, when are we meeting? Are we meeting on Saturday? I saw a few communications, you know, because it's not always clear. So what method are you using? And we're going to usually have multiple methods to communicate. And so that's important to kind of start thinking about it. Telephone. Now, are we using the phone as much as we used to? You know, teenagers. It's interesting how teenagers communicate nowadays. A lot of them send text messages or chat messages or short videos to somebody. They don't pick up the phone as much anymore. But do we pick up the phone? Do we communicate to a potential customer or to a friend? A lot of it is video conferencing, right? Because of COVID, we did a lot of Zoom messaging or different kinds of ways we use FaceTime or different methods, you know, Microsoft Teams, you know, Google Meet, all these different methods. But if we're talking on the phone specifically, a couple of things to consider, and this is important for most messages, you know, obviously, before we pick up the phone, we want to know why we're calling that person. Basic, right? We're not just going to pick up the phone and just dial, hey, sometimes it's just, we just want to talk, right? We'll pick up the phone to call a friend. Things to think about. when we're on a call, polite, active listening. It's not just face to face. If I'm on a call, and this happens, and I'm sure you've experienced this, raise your hand if this has happened to you. You're talking to somebody on the phone, and you can tell they're doing something else. You could tell maybe they're eating. You could tell maybe they're reading an email. You could tell maybe they're having a conversation with somebody else, or they're listening. They have multiple screens on their phone, and then maybe they have the news on. They're half listening to you. You can tell that, right? And so active listening doesn't just mean face to face. It means when we're talking on the phone. Now, if it's a good friend, they give us a little bit of leeway, right? Sometimes we can ask and they say something and we're like, I didn't hear you, you know? And sometimes I give my friend a little bit of hard time jokingly and say, you know, put down your food, or listen, this is important, right? So we need to understand that too. It's two-way communication. Maybe you're actively listening and they aren't, or maybe they are and you aren't. And then again, from the standpoint of a selling transaction, if we're talking, because this is a sales class, do we give the customer a chance, if we're selling on the phone or if we're communicating on the phone, to ask questions, right? This class, do I give you a chance to ask questions, right? We have you can raise your hand and talk, right? On the telephone, you can't always do that. So sometimes you need to give them, do you have any questions? Is there something that's not clear? Or you can intuitively know that maybe they're giving you kind of half answers, that they don't understand what you're saying to them. Communicating with my kids, my kids, I have one teenager and one older, and it's like you kind of know, I'm talking to on the phone, which sometimes we still have phone conversations because they're away at school. I can tell when they're doing something else. I could tell when they're understanding. And I need to be aware when I'm not communicating in a way that they understand. I need to make it two-way. Okay? So think about this. Voicemail. Are we leaving voice messages for people anymore? I don't know. Raise your hand if you leave messages anymore. A lot of times people don't. But if we do, kind of think about clear message. Don't want to speak very fast. So I guess some of us are still using voice messages to communicate. But now I think people, you don't reach somebody and somebody important, you send them a text or a chat or something, right? We don't want to leave a long message. I'm not going to name names, but I can think of people in my life that they'll leave me a message and it is 2-minute message or longer. And they just ramble on and on about things. That's not the point of a communication. Now, obviously, if I asked them to call and they couldn't reach me, and they're giving me information that's important and said, I can't reach you. Here's how you fix this. Okay. And they're giving me a long message, then that's okay. Are you then, as you communicate this, think about this. There's this, we'll call it a CTA, call to action. This is important in sales or anything that you're doing. Call to action means, are you giving them something to do? What do you want them to do based on what you just did? Do you want them to call you back? Do you want them to call somebody else? Do you want them to do something? I call that a call to action. I mean, a lot of people call it that, a call to action. But think about when we're making a communication. Think about, again, if it's not in a sales and we're trying to influence them, what is the call to action? What do I want the other person or group to do And it could be anything. Make the purchase, pick up the phone and call me back. It could be, again, this is what you need to do. You need to go to the store and buy this. And obviously, repeat your name and phone number. I don't know. Again, this comes from the textbook. I got to be real. Sometimes his textbooks are not the most, real life, right? But because, nowadays, if you call on a voicemail and you leave it, they know the phone number that you're dialing, right? So maybe we don't even need to leave the number. I'm old school. I still leave my number. You can reach me. This is Todd. Hey, you can reach me. It's Professor Todd at X number. Okay, I always do that. So let's talk a little bit about email and text messages. That's more appropriate. I think a lot of people are communicating in that way. Mohammed, you have a question? Or
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
go ahead.
Yes. Because the type of the communication, which is depending on the writing a message or an email or WhatsApp message or whatever, this is the lowest, I would say, communication channel between anyone and other one, because the other one, which is leaving a voice message or something like that, is much efficient, I would say, more than writing an email or even writing a message. Is it right? Because I know that by percentage, the message, the writing message, it's only transferring 7% of what you want to say, but while the other one is about 38%, is something like that from the statistics. So what do you see? Or you are just here showing us the different kind of communication through different channels like email or whatever. So
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Mohammed, for asking. And let me tell you. So yes, we're going to go over different kinds, right? So these are all different kinds, but you're talking about, maybe effectiveness, right? The effectiveness of your message, and part of it is knowing who you're communicating to, and what you're communicating about. Okay. If it's urgent, right? We can talk about this. I think the book gets into this a little bit. An urgent message to somebody. And again, we need to think about, we're a world group now, meaning we're communicating with people all over the world. Some people, they're sleeping. So I might send an email or might send a text message. Text is a little more time specific, a little more urgent, right, than an email. I was helping somebody and I knew they were traveling and it wasn't urgent information. I sent it via email. It was important, but not urgent. If it was urgent, I would send them a text so that they would look at it more closely. But that was me thinking, okay, my information, while it's important to me, it's not urgent. And so if they look at it in 6 hours, that's okay. But if you're communicating with somebody, and I'll get back to this voice message because that's important. Sometimes we communicate through social media, LinkedIn, right? Or Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp, or something we could use in the social media. We could use voice messaging. Again, you don't want to leave a long voice message. But for instance, I was communicating with somebody, they're 5 hours ahead of me in time. And I sent them a text message through a chat. The next day, they send me a voice message because they hadn't talked to me in a while. And it was good to hear their voice. And that was powerful. They didn't have to do it that way, but they felt that was more effective. And for me, I received it really well. So what did I do? I sent them a voice message back. And I was like, hey, this is what's going on. And sometimes they're limited, thank goodness. Like you can't leave a voice message for more than like 59 seconds in certain message systems. So you need to kind of think about, Mohammed, think about who you're communicating to and the kind of message you're communicating. And within that will tell you a lot about what method is most effective. Now, when we're communicating via text and email, think about a couple things. Again, the book says don't use emojis. But I'm thinking, if even your customer is a good friend of yours, use an emoji if that's how you communicate. Maybe they do. I had a very well-known sports coach that I had partnered with to do some training with me. This guy's world renowned in what he does. He uses emojis to communicate in an email, in a text message, like a happy face. So I would think he's like the most professional, polished person. He's English, uses emojis. So the biggest thing I think we need to kind of think about is, who are we communicating to, and what is the main point we're communicating? And is it urgent or not? If we ask those questions, then we'll be able to figure out maybe what's the best way to communicate with them. Okay? And then think about some of these other points are important, right? The tone. If you're typing a text or email, there's a tone there. You're reading words, yes, but you can tell. You've gotten a message before. You can tell when somebody is being smart with you. You could tell when somebody's being a little mean. You can tell when somebody's being delightful to talk to in a message. There's a tone that it sets. So as you read the message you're sending, sometimes we hit send before we reread it. That's a really good thing. We should always reread the message we send. I've sent messages that I shouldn't have by accident. You push the reply all button, and it should have been to one person. I've done that before. I could say that the communication wasn't well received when I did that. I'm very careful now about how I do that. So I make sure I'm communicating in the right way to the right person, in the right method, right? Tone is important. Email and text messages, not as necessarily for text, but email important. Subject lines are critical. Subject lines are critical. You're communicating with somebody about something that's important but not urgent. What is your subject line? If your subject line is very boring, they're not going to want to read it. But if it pertains directly to them, yes. If you're in marketing, if you want to communicate well to somebody else, you have to communicate in a way that they will relate to. And so you might use a subject line that is catching, that they understand. When I send messages out after I do a coaching call with say a student athlete, I write up an email about all the things we talked about, what's most important. And I send that to them or to their parents or to their coach. I write specifically what it is. I put down, this is the coaching recap, and I put the date because that's important for them in that moment. So kind of think about, and another piece to think about, if we're communicating good news or bad news, right? Elena shared a story about, poor communication that happened that she was able to solve, and the customer is now happy. They're getting the software that they wanted and the service that they wanted, but it wasn't that way initially. And that's kind of, you could say bad news. What if the customer sent Elena, it was urgent, but they sent her an email and said the subject line was like, had nothing to do with, I have a big problem that your company needs to solve. Maybe it was like, all they said was Elena's name or, the company name. That didn't communicate the urgency of the message. No, they picked up the phone, they called, they said, got a problem here. This needs to be solved right away. So that dictated the method of communication. That also dictated the subject line or what words were used. That's most important in the communication style. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about social media. I mean, if we're engaged in social media, salespeople could use it, again, to showcase what they're doing. I have a website for my business, and it talks about the book that I wrote. It talks about some of the work that I do, some of the customers that have gone through my program that have been happy, right? So that is a communication. Sometimes I write an article or I post something on LinkedIn or Instagram, and they see. A lot of people that have products post on Instagram. There are some drinks that I like. That one is called kombucha, which is like a fermented drink. It's fermented tea. And there's a particular brand that I noticed that I like, so I followed them on social media. And they're always posting cool things about health and why their products are so helpful. So part of it is, how do we use, here's the question for you. Again, may not be in sales, even if social media is not part and you don't have a product or service to sell, you still have you, right? LinkedIn, again, is a great place for business to business. If we're marketing ourselves, that's social media. Doesn't have to be Facebook or Snapchat or WhatsApp or TikTok, but it might be important. So just kind of think about the messages you have to promote yourself or your company or product. What's most appropriate? Where are your customers? What did they have? Where do you go? If you have products that you buy, do you shop for them on the internet? Where do you find them? Right? So, and then if you find a brand that you like, maybe you like that brand on social media, so you see that more. Used to be where things are sent in the mail. My goodness, here, I'm in the United States, we still get a ton of catalogs. Tons, and mail's expensive, postage, right? People communicate through the mail, regular mail in sales. Okay, so I get a lot of that. It's not even covered in the book, which is funny because I'm like, but I still get a lot of it. And I'm like, that's expensive. Why am I getting it? But those same companies have social media and they send me a catalog, a hand catalog. Sometimes I like to read the catalogs too. I don't always like to look online at an online catalog. Who are my customers? What method do they want me to communicate to them to? If my person I'm communicating is in my company, what is the best method to communicate? Maybe I send them an email. Maybe I send them a text message. Maybe I send them a direct message on Facebook Messenger because I know they like Facebook. I got to know how and what I'm communicating. So these are just some of the salespeople should. I hate that word should, but that's what, they say in the book. Again, I'm not a huge fan of some of the language. I changed the language on some of these, but I want to be mindful of the language the book is using. So think about this. If you're communicating on social media, just a few of the things maybe to think about. Sharing articles and links about presentations, that might be helpful. Pictures, testimonials, people that did a good job. If you are interviewing for a job, you give references, people that could vouch for you that you do good work, right? People that vouch for your character. If, like I said on my website, I have satisfied customers. And sometimes I write a note and put that in a social media because I know my people that are following me that want to use my service, they read Instagram. A lot of the coaches use LinkedIn. Those are my methods. A lot of people, I know if I want to talk to parents more, they use Facebook more. So there's a group that I joined in Facebook and I post things there that are helpful. I use a casual language. I'm not, being very, I'm going to use this word, even though it's a selling class, salesy. I don't want to seem salesy, like I want something. I want them to know I'm adding value. There's that word again. What value are you adding? Think about this. You're communicating with somebody in any of these methods, social media, email, text message. What is the value you're communicating? It may just be answering a question. That's a value. It may be communicating information. That's a value. It may be sharing with them something that worked out well. That's a value. So think from that standpoint. Again, if we're putting social media and we're using that to market who we are, to get noticed, think about linking to, we use email, social media, link from one to the other. Sometimes I have that. If I send somebody an email, I have a link they can directly click on to go to my book and purchase my book. They have a link to go to my website. They also have a link on, if they go to my website, they can go right to Instagram or wherever. So it's kind of like crossing platforms is important. So kind of think about that. But that's really all, the rest of the stuff, we're not going to talk much about in terms of communication style. But I want you just to think about, even what Muhammad said, the difference, if we use a voice message to communicate, because we can send a voice message through WhatsApp, right? Sometimes should we send a video message? Is that more impactful? If we send a video message to a customer or to, is that important? I was talking to my kids in college, my younger one, and he missed his dog. So we had a voice conversation. We switched from voice to video so he could see his dog. Communication. And he was talking to his dog, right? And he saw his dog. That was important. Obviously, I'm just giving you the breadth and depth of how we communicate. It's expansive. But the same principles are applying no matter how we're communicating. Think about what you have to communicate. Think about why you're communicating. Think about who you're communicating to, how they like to be communicated normally, what is their method, what's successful. And then within all that is, the rapport. It's the active listening. It's the asking good question. It's the being kind in the conversation. It's the sometimes you have to ask hard questions. If you're in sales, you have to sometimes ask hard questions like, do you want to buy my product now? Sometimes it's like we're bashful, right? Or, sometimes we don't like that. Is there anything else you do not understand? Sometimes we're like hopeful that they understand everything, wishful thinking. But a great question, you're talking to somebody. Does that make sense to you? Do you understand it clearly? Is there any questions that you have? I ask that of friends a lot, right? I'm communicating an idea with them. Does that make sense? Do you want me to repeat it? How do you think that will work for you? And so there's lots of, again, this, when we talk about, we've talked a lot about, nonverbal communication. In a sense, email is like a nonverbal communication because there's tone of voice in there. Voice messages is a nonverbal communication in a sense because we can hear things in it, even though it's verbal. So there's like so much in terms of the way we can talk to a potential customer, or so much in terms of when we are the buyer. And we have certain ways that we like to be communicated to. just like other people do. And we just need to be aware of that. And then timing, we need to kind of think about, what's going on. I'm going to pull back something from the week 1, emotional intelligence, because this is important in how we're talking about communication. Is there something that you're not hearing that's going on in their life that's preventing them from communicating something to you? Are they hiding something? Or the nonverbal they're giving you, the facial expression, again, it might have nothing to do with you. It might be that they're in pain. It might be that they're thinking about something that they have to do later that's difficult. So we need to find that out. All right? So I'm going to close out that conversation on communication styles. We're going to start and go through a little bit in chapter 5. 5 is this really, it starts to get into like the selling process a little bit. Okay. Communication is with everything. All right. There's always this communication piece that we're going to be talking about. But as you start to see when we go through selling and how we gather and build relationships, it's for everything, right? This chapter is about, this adaptive selling for relationships, meaning how flexible can we be based on who we're talking to and how we're talking to them. That's really what this is about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about adaptive selling. Again, I can change that word selling to communicating. Adaptive communication. If we're talking to somebody, I got some clients that I work with. They do not like to talk very much. They're kind of shy. Maybe know somebody like that. So it's almost like, I use this expression, it's like pulling teeth. It's very difficult to get them to talk. And I have clients like that. So I need to be very creative in the way I ask my questions to get them to communicate. And so I need to come up with all kinds of analogies. We talked about that. To tell a story, I talk about stories. And that way, then all of a sudden, it gets them to, a light bulb goes on in their head, and then they can communicate. And maybe they only say 5 words, then ask another question. Then they think about it for a while. There's that pause. See, the stuff that we're learning, it's life skills. It's communication styles. This piece of adaptive selling, again, I'm going to call it adaptive communication because that's critical, to be flexible. This is where, if you're really good at changing your style of communicating, changing your style of selling, changing your style of talking to somebody to get them to buy into an idea you have, you'll be influential. You'll be successful, right? So we talk a little bit about why this is important. I just said it. You can be successful, right? And how do we get this knowledge, right? If we're going to be adaptive in our communicating style, how do we learn that? We're going to talk about that too, because that's important, right? And then different salespeople, if you think about it, how do we adapt our strategies, our presentations? If you think back to that 8 steps buying behavior, okay? Think back to that. Those 8 steps, from the time we're evaluating a product to, or a service, to all the way to their analyzing, did it work well? Is it a good product? All those, how do I make my decision? What am I looking at? All those steps in between, the evaluation and the analyses and everything that we do. All that, if we're good at it, we adapt our style to meet those steps. Because somebody that's evaluating the success of our product or service or our communication, they might have one way they evaluate that has nothing to do with the way I've been helping them evaluate. And so I need to find out how they work and how they do, and be adaptive and talk in the way they understand that. So there's another person, and I'll share this in the chat here. You may know this author, Stephen Covey. Spell it correctly here. Stephen Covey. He was a management author. Talked a lot about communication. This is a very famous book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Okay. It was written, I think, in the 1980s or late 80s or early 90s. You may have heard that before. Most of that book is about communication. Most of that book is about adaptive communication styles. Covey also has a book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Salespeople. It's the same 7 habits for selling. So you can kind of see where, I'm trying to give you some sense of, if you want to get really good at some of these skills, yes, the book is helpful. Yes, this class is really good. But when we're done with our 15 weeks, you want to really get into, how do I adapt my style for somebody else? Read 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. One of the things they talk about in that book is exactly what we talked about in the last chapter. Seek first to understand, then be understood. Seek first to understand, then be understood. That's the 80-20 rule. That's asking more questions and listening really well and not talking 80% of the time. If we're seeking first to understand of the other, then we are just asking questions and listening. And we are decoding what they're saying and then asking another question. That's selling. If we're successful at selling, we can do that really well. Okay? So let's get into this here. Different types of presentations. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about this, in terms of relationships. Presentation styles. And we've all been exposed to some of these. Memorized, standardized, right? If I went through the slides of this presentation and just read through the slides and did nothing else, that's standard memorized presentation. That's boring, right? You could do that and you're probably not going to get a whole lot out of it, right? But sometimes people give presentations like that. They put slides, they just read from the slides, they don't give you any examples, they don't ask questions, they don't do extra. Sometimes that's appropriate. Honestly, if you have a short product, a product that is not very complicated, and you're just doing a quick video, marketing video of your product, maybe it's just 5 points, 5 slides, you show the product, boom, done. Better, I say better, meaning it's more thoughtful. This is a continuum here. You make an outline presentation. You can do this for the conversations that you're having, right? Think about this. What are my points am I going to make in the conversation? Why am I calling this person? Why am I going to talk to them? What are my 5 points? What are my selling points? You outline things. So the ideas are there. They're standardized, but there's a little interpretation. You can leave room to customize a little bit. And then this other type of presentation, think about communications that we do, completely customized for the customer. And how do you do that? You got to get to know them. What do they want? What do they need? What's important to them? You got to do the 80-20 rule, or at least what I said, you 2 ears and 1 mouth. Listen twice as much as you talk. You got to find out what's important to them. And that's what you communicate back to them. And if you don't know what's important to them, that's when you got to listen and ask questions. So in building this relationship with this, we'll call it again, adaptive selling, the customized, as you see, takes the most time. And you don't always have to do it, but it's important. So if you're making a presentation in a work setting, there's no selling other than you want them to buy into your idea, right? Do you have a canned presentation as a standard? Do you have outlines, or is it customized for the audience? What will be most effective? That's, again, your choice here. So canned, again, I've been talking about this. We don't spend a lot of time on it. Canned is canned, right? It's memorized. It's verbatim. There's not a lot of effectiveness to it, okay? But there's some benefits to it because it doesn't take a lot of time, okay? If you do an outline for a presentation, you might have the same introduction, you might have the same points you bring up, but you really tailor the organization to a way that the customer will understand, to the way the person you're communicating will understand. Then it becomes more effective. The outline presentation, you think about for selling, it's sort of like, you could think of the model, those 8 steps for buying behavior. This is kind of like steps to do a presentation. Some of these things are important. They're all important in one way or another. But you're talking about, if you're talking in selling, or you're talking to somebody that that you work with, it's sometimes helpful to reinforce, to talk about the times they were happy before, the successes they had. You're going to talk about what they need, right? You're going to introduce a new campaign. You're going to introduce perhaps something new, a new product, a new service, a new way that you're doing something. You're going to explain how that works. Give them examples of how it's worked for others. And so in a sales presentation, obviously, if it is selling, hopefully they buy from you, right? Thank you. Certainly. Basic stuff, but I just want you to kind of see that more important, know those questions. Who am I communicating with? What is the method I'm using? What's most important? What is the way they like to be communicated to? What will be most effective? And so you go based on that, and then you can kind of customize. I think everything, in a sense, when you're having a conversation with somebody, you're customizing something because you're talking to a specific person. And so they have specific needs and they have specific problems for you to find out. And even a conversation between friends, it's like, even if it's like a chit chat, hey, let's catch up. What's going on? What's going on is what's important to them. If they're bringing it up, it must be important to them. Do they have any needs? Meaning they want to be heard. Obviously, they're talking about it. Maybe they need a solution that you can provide, advice, right? Don't have to call it sales. It's communication. All right. This model of adaptive selling, when we kind of get into it, it's about how do we, that word they use, customize. I like that. It's like adapting. It's customizing based on what the customer or the person we're talking to needs most, right? That's important. In the selling situation that that somebody shared about the TVs, think about if that was adaptive selling. The first salesperson, not very adaptive. They sold in the way that they sell that's comfortable to them and didn't do a very good job, right? They tried to push a product and points that were not important. The next salesperson that came in, options, ask questions. Here's this feature. You want this? This is good. Oh, you need this? Then look at this. Here's 3 models, you choose. That's adaptive selling. Okay? Adaptive selling is more successful selling. Adaptive selling is more successful selling. Adaptive communication is more successful communication. And how do we get adaptive selling? A lot of those skills we just talked about: active listening, good questioning, reading nonverbals, communicating in the way that they want to be communicated to. and figuring out what's sometimes those hidden messages. Why are they not saying something? That's adaptive selling, adaptive communication. You see what happens, they say results in higher sales performance, of course. But I'll say it results in this chapter is about relationships. It results in a better relationship, in a trusting relationship where there's commitment, right? And so that becomes the way we work. Elena shared the problem with the software and the implementation that the customer was wanting. That's adaptive selling. Adaptive. Even dealing with problems that a customer has, that's adaptive. It wasn't a canned way. Oh, here's the tech department, call them, they'll work you through it. No, she's the intermediary between her and these other people in her company that are servicing. And she had to figure out, how do I do it? That's adaptive selling. That's very successful selling. Okay. So in order to be successful at this, think about this. You have to be able to change your presentation style. You have to be able to change how you're communicating. Maybe the customer can't hear you very well because it's loud where they're at. They're in a machine factory. Maybe you need to talk louder. Maybe you need to have that conversation and follow up with a written communication, with a written proposal, written email, and a follow-up. And so maybe you take them to lunch after too, right? So there's lots of different ways to be adaptive in selling. What is the knowledge required? I mean, what do we need to know to be good at adaptive selling or adaptive communication? Think about this. We talked about this in the very first class too. You know, if you don't know all about your product, you have other people that can help you, but sometimes you need to know so the customer understands they're dealing with somebody that is knowledgeable, that's competent, right? So, but you need to know about your company and your product or your service. And you need to know well enough where you could adapt your style for them. Maybe you have, and I'll go back to the hardwood flooring finish company that I was. We had lots of products. We had products, and ours were higher priced than others. They were the premium product. But even within that, we had levels. So I'm selling my product to a mom and pop hardware store in a small town where people didn't have a ton of money. Okay. So I had to keep in mind, okay, how is my adaptive? I can't be selling the top of the line product that I have, even though it's great. I have to keep in mind, okay, here's how I know they're going to talk about budget is a big deal for them. So I have to adapt my style. I'm the top price of all the competitors out there, but I have a lower price product in my bag of products, and that's adaptive selling. Can selling is, I got 5 great products. You need to buy these all. They're amazing, which they were, of course. You're selling them. Of course, they're amazing, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't be working for the company. I'm just kind of kidding here. But they're good products. Adaptive selling is knowing what you have that best fits your customer. Okay? You need to know about the sales situation and customer. I think this is even more important sometimes than your product or service, because again, we talk about what's going on with them. How do they make their decisions? What's behind how they evaluate their products? And I like this bullet point here because I think it's the most important thing. Can you make it less complex? Even selling manufacturing equipment that are $2 million or more, or you're selling jet planes that are hundreds of millions of dollars, can you reduce the complexity? This next bullet point, I think, is it speaks to me, but it speaks to, I think, what we're trying to do. freeing up mental capacity to think more creatively. Are we cluttering our person we're talking to with meaningless information? Think about this. There are people that I talk to, and we're going to wrap it up in about 10 minutes here. I just want to give you a heads up. So we will not get through this entire chapter, but we're going to go through some of this a little bit more. All right. So 10 minutes will be done. And then again, remember, we're meeting on Saturday and then the following Saturday too. But I'll communicate that as we talk about in multiple ways. All right. Freeing up mental capacity. That's important. This is adaptive selling. Even if we have a complex software, right? We're an engineer. This is, what we're communicating somebody is technical. Even if they understand it, we don't want to make it so complex that they have to think so hard that they're going to head is going to explode. How can we communicate it in a way that frees up mental capacity, mental space, so that they can think more clearly and creatively, so that we're not cluttering their mind with useless data? I have some friends, God bless them, they're wonderful, but they talk a lot about a lot of meaningless stuff in a conversation that's just not important. But they spend their day in communicating a lot of meaningless stuff, which they think is important, but they're not aware of what the other person thinks is meaningful because they don't listen. They're wonderful people. They just don't listen as well. And so think about this, and I'm not perfect at it. I think we all can get better, certainly, right? There are times I don't listen well enough. I'm growing, I'm getting better. But I think we need to think about adaptive selling, adaptive communication. Is what we're talking about important to the other person? Or are we just giving a lot of fluff? I mean, if we're selling, sometimes there is a lot of fluff we put in there. We're trying to build a product value in their mind. So sometimes we do have to add a little fluff, okay? But is it meaningful? Still some of the data we want to, just to tell people about 5 people that use my service that like my product, like my consulting service and my coaching. For some people, that's fine. I have another customer, they couldn't care less. They could not care less who used my service, that they were satisfied. They want to know what they're getting is pertinent to them. So I need to communicate in a style and adaptively communicate and not talk about this person was happy with me and I did this person. Again, they don't care. What am I going to do for them? What's important for them? Communicated in a way that they understand. That frees up mental space for them, because I've made a mistake sometimes, and I'm in sales right now, communicating my coaching services to people. I'm communicating things that is not important to them. It sounds great, but if I were to then stop before I did that and ask, well, what's important to you? Or if I was more aware of some of the nonverbals, because again, we're not perfect, I might have picked up on the fact that, or if I did my homework more, I see how they like to be sold or communicated to. And if I keep that in mind and make it less complex, then there's more space for them to think clearly and creatively, because they can think creatively and think about how they're going to use my product or service. That's what I want to get them thinking, right? If you're communicating an idea you want to get another person to buy into, you want to have them buy into it. What does that mean? You want to get them thinking about using your idea. If you can do that, boy, you've made the sale, you've made the communication, you've got whatever message meaningfully communicated. That's powerful. So let me just finish up here, and then, in these last 3-4 minutes here, ways in which we create knowledge. Okay, this is kind of important to think about, and then we'll pick this up again on Saturday when we meet, 11 a.m. Eastern time. Again, we're going back to a different time and a different day. Gaining knowledge from the company. Okay. This is like, you think about top performing salespeople, or those that are best at what they do, best at communicating. They are really good at what's called these 2 methods of feedback, performance feedback. They are really good. And this is like, this is like a sales manager. I want us to kind of think about this for ourselves in this way. Okay, as we evaluate ourselves, in that very first class, I talked about being self-aware. I said one of the most important pieces, obviously, in being a good salesperson and communicating effectively is being self-aware, that emotional intelligence to know how we're feeling, what's happening. But we have to evaluate. If we're going to be self-aware, we need to evaluate. So can we do this for ourselves? Think about this performance feedback. How effective were we? Do we ask that question, like if we're communicating and somebody's having a hard time understanding what we're saying? Do we evaluate ourselves? Not to say you did a good job, you did a bad job. No, how can I be more effective? What did I do well? What can I do better? That's performance feedback. If we're in sales, obviously, did we make the sale or not? Did we get them? Our call to action was not, maybe it takes a long time to make the sale. Maybe we want them to use our product or use the software and try it out. Maybe that is the call to action. So they're going to try it out for 30 days or this project or whatever. How did I do at getting them to understand that that's what I wanted them to do? If I did a good job, the performance is great. If not, that's good feedback too, because that means there's still something I need to do better. Okay, diagnostic feedback, okay, in terms of the information that we're getting. This business of, doing it right or wrong, I'm going to say, changing that language and saying, did what I communicate work or not? If we go based on just making the sale, just them buying into the information, that's one piece, right? But how did I do within that? Meaning that did it take me an hour to communicate this one point? And yes, then they bought into my idea. Or could I have done it in 10 minutes? What was working, what's not working, right? I'm, a parent, I have kids, and sometimes I communicate ideas to them of things that they do. If I know that they don't want to do it, I communicate it in a way I try to make it appealing to them. But I also evaluate how my communication style is with them. If I keep communicating in the same way that's not effective, that's not getting good feedback. That's not diagnosing what I'm doing well and doing that I can do better. Hopefully, I'm always getting better. But part of it is assessing where I'm at and what's working and what's not. That's important. So this last slide is all I'm going to say about some of where do we get information? And I'll leave this up to you, right? To make ourselves more knowledgeable about anything, about sales, about who we're dealing with, about the company, about the customer, about our friend. Where do we get information? Okay. Sometimes it is the web, right? If there's a person that I want to meet that I haven't yet talked to, I'll Google search them and see what I can find on them, right? We use the web. I might get to their LinkedIn profile and see what they're about. Oh, they have this, they have that. Oh, there's these common connections that I know. They like baseball, I like baseball. Oh, they're posting about restaurants they go to. They obviously like pasta. They like different kinds of food that I like or something. Or maybe they're like posting about service issues. I had this customer that was terrible. They didn't service me. I can get a lot of information from the web. Company sales manuals, newsletters, right? If you're dealing with somebody and they posted something, maybe they have a newsletter, maybe they're, a company, how do you get information, right? Printed materials, catalogs. Talking to other people that have been successful. So if there's somebody that I need to communicate, maybe there's a client that I'm working with, and I have another client that has worked with this, we'll call it client A and client B. I want to communicate with client B. I've never worked with them before. Communicated with client A a lot. And A knows B really well. I'm going to talk to A, client A, and say, I got a call in with one of your buddies, client B. Any advice you have for me to talk to them? They might give you, never mention about their family situation. They just got divorced or something like that. And you'd be like, okay, got it, right? Because they're going through a tough time. Or don't talk about X. Or they really like this. Okay. There's sales meetings. There's visits to their business, right? If you like a particular product and they have a store in your neighborhood, or you're visiting another city and they have a store, you like their products, you might visit it and get a whole new sense of what their products are about. Right? There are stores that are only in certain cities in the United States or in the world, or restaurants. And you might read about them, and all of a sudden then you're there and you're experiencing. It's very different. Other customers might give you information that have worked with who you're going to talk to, right? Trade shows, there are conventions. There are all kinds of places we can get knowledge. This is, again, how do we get the knowledge to be more knowledgeable, to adapt our selling style, adapt our communication style? And knowing what the competitors have, that's helpful too. So we're going to stop there right now in terms of this idea about adaptive selling. We'll get into a little bit more in a minute, or a little bit more on Saturday. But I wanted to give you a sense, like, to just recap here. We talked a lot. Well, we finished up, remember, the assignment. Eventually, it will show up on Microsoft Teams, and it will show up in Moodle, okay, about the 8-step buying behavior process. How you'll write 1 to 3 pages, taking a particular point of view of a buyer or seller, using one or more of those 8 methods, okay? And then we talked a little bit about, in the second section, listening styles, nonverbal. And then lastly, we're talking now about adaptive style. Do you see what I just did? Summarized everything for you. Okay, so that's all I have for you in this class. Again, we're meeting on Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern time on Saturday. And then the following Saturday. Because there's a short window here of, there's only 5 days in between, I have the assignment listed for chapter 6, but I will not have a quiz, okay, because there's a short time. So there'll be no quiz for next week. Don't worry about that. I wanted to give you a little bit of extra time to work on the assignment, okay? So again, have a great rest of your evening, a great rest of your day. I will see everybody Saturday. Thank you for joining us. And I'll talk to you on Saturday for the next class. We'll finish up adaptive learning. Okay? Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.